A young female cop cuffs a black man right outside a store, just because he was waiting for his sister to get off work. But only 72 hours later, she finds herself standing in court, face to face with a black judge who was once wrongfully imprisoned himself. A judge known for having zero tolerance for anyone who abuses their authority. Morning broke quietly over Richmond, Virginia, as local shops began opening their doors along a modest neighborhood street. The area was calm, familiar, just another day beginning without fanfare. Between a dental clinic and a small convenience store, the sidewalk remained mostly empty, except for a lone figure waiting patiently by the door. Officer Hailey Moore stepped from her patrol car, adjusting her uniform as she glanced quickly up and down the street. Her radio murmured softly, breaking the silence. Unit 17, reports of a suspicious individual outside Lakeside Convenience. Possible loitering. Copy, responding. Hailey replied evenly, beginning to approach the store with purposeful steps. She quickly noticed Elijah Ward standing by the entrance, dressed neatly in a collared shirt and dark slacks, his attention focused casually on his phone. He looked like he belonged here, but Hailey's steps didn't slow. Her gaze fixed firmly on him, assessing him closely. "Morning," Hailey called out, voice firm but neutral, stopping just a few feet away. Elijah looked up from his phone, slightly surprised by the interruption. "Good morning, officer," Elijah responded, polite but cautious. "Can I see your ID, please?" she asked directly. Elijah hesitated, brows furrowing gently. "Is there a problem?" "I'm just waiting for my sister. She works right next door." "I need your ID," Hailey repeated, her tone slightly sharper this time, her eyes never leaving him. He nodded slowly, reaching carefully for his back pocket. "Sure, just grabbing my wallet." "Hands out of your pockets," she ordered immediately, voice suddenly tight, her hand subtly moving closer to her service weapon. Elijah froze briefly, confusion clear in his expression. "Officer, I'm complying, I just need to—" "I said keep your hands visible," Hailey interrupted sharply, taking a deliberate step forward. Pedestrians nearby slowed down, sensing the tension and quietly pulling out their phones to film. "All right," Elijah replied, voice calm but wary. He raised both hands slowly, wallet now half exposed in his back pocket. "I'm not causing any trouble." Hailey didn't wait. In a swift movement, she grabbed his wrist firmly, turning him abruptly toward the storefront. Elijah instinctively stiffened, surprise overtaking his calm demeanor. "What are you doing?" he asked sharply, voice tense with shock. "Stop resisting!" she snapped back, quickly pulling his arms behind him and securing handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click echoed clearly, unsettlingly loud on the quiet street. Elijah's voice shook slightly, trying to reason. "Officer, please, this is a mistake." From the dental clinic, a woman wearing scrubs rushed out, eyes wide with panic. She moved quickly toward them, urgency clear in her movements. "What are you doing?" she called out, disbelief coloring her voice. "That's my brother. What are you arresting him for?" Hailey glanced sharply toward her, momentarily thrown, as the gathered bystanders continued filming silently. Inside a modest law office downtown, Patricia Ward sat tensely beside her daughter, Nicole. Across the table, attorney Trina Lowell listened quietly, jotting brief notes on a legal pad. The small office was neatly organized, lined with framed photographs of past cases, silent reminders of her experience in civil rights litigation. "They arrested Elijah for standing outside the convenience store," Patricia explained, her voice strained but controlled. "He was just waiting for Nicole." Nicole spoke quickly, her tone sharp but calm. "He comes every Thursday, right on time. We always meet during my lunch break. He's never caused trouble." Trina raised an eyebrow slightly, glancing down at her notes. "Did the officer provide any reason for the arrest?" Patricia shook her head, clearly upset but composed. "They said he was acting suspiciously, But he didn't do anything. There were people around, Nicole added firmly. Some of them recorded everything on their phones. Trina nodded thoughtfully, setting her pen down. Good. If there's clear footage, it'll strengthen our case significantly. You'll represent us? Patricia asked quietly, looking directly at the attorney. Trina gave a firm, reassuring nod. Absolutely. At the federal courthouse, Judge Isaiah Langston sat behind his polished wooden desk, carefully reviewing the arrest report filed by Officer Hailey Moore. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read phrases that felt exaggerated, almost scripted. Subject exhibited aggressive behavior. High-risk area. Officer perceived immediate threat. Langston turned a page slowly, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. He glanced up, addressing his assistant, a young man named Daniel, who stood respectfully by the doorway. Daniel, request Officer Moore's full body camera footage from the arrest, Langston instructed quietly. And get me her training records, too. Yes, Your Honor, Daniel responded promptly, leaving the room without another word. Langston leaned back in his chair momentarily, the arrest report still open before him. His eyes remained focused, analytical. Nothing about this case sat comfortably. His instincts, honed through years of examining similar incidents, raised immediate red flags. At the precinct, Hailey stood near the coffee machine, holding a cup and recounting the morning's events confidently to a small circle of colleagues. Her voice carried clearly, pride evident in her tone. He didn't want to cooperate, she stated firmly. You give these people an inch, they'll take advantage. I handled it exactly how it needed to be handled. Sergeant Palmer watched quietly from across the room, a subtle tension evident in his jaw. His eyes met hers briefly, conveying caution and disappointment without words. Nearby, Officer Reed lowered his voice, leaning slightly toward Hailey, careful but serious. You better hope this doesn't land on Judge Langston's desk. He doesn't tolerate mistakes, especially ones that look bad. Hailey dismissed his concern quickly, waving a casual hand. I followed procedure. Langston's tough, but fair. I'm not worried. Reed shrugged slightly, stepping back unconvinced. Later, back in chambers, Langston studied the gathered files closely. He paused, eyes fixed again on Hailey's name. His expression hardened subtly, a deep recognition settling into his gaze. Under his breath, he murmured with quiet resolve, Same old story. But not this time. This time, it won't end the way they expect. The courtroom fell quiet as Judge Isaiah Langston took his seat at the bench. His gaze slowly swept the room, calm, commanding, and utterly focused. Beside Elijah Ward, Attorney Trina Lowell rose promptly, a tablet firmly in hand. Your Honor, Trina began clearly, facing Langston directly. The defense requests immediate dismissal of all charges against Mr. Ward. We have video evidence recorded by bystanders, along with surveillance footage from the store, clearly contradicting Officer Moore's account. Langston leaned forward slightly, nodding once. Proceed, Counselor. Trina signaled an assistant. Within moments, a large screen at the front lit up with clear footage from a smartphone. The video showed Elijah standing quietly near the convenience store entrance, calmly texting, posture relaxed. Langston's eyes narrowed thoughtfully as he studied the recording. Trina briefly paused the video. As the court can plainly see, Mr. Ward exhibited no threatening or suspicious behavior. He was simply waiting outside for his sister. The video resumed, this time from the store's security camera. The angle was higher, capturing Elijah clearly. He stood motionless, peaceful, and unobtrusive. Moments later, Officer Hailey Moore appeared, approaching swiftly, aggressively. The footage played clearly, uninterrupted, showing the entire interaction exactly as it unfolded. At the prosecution table, Hailey shifted uneasily, eyes fixed rigidly forward. Her previously confident demeanor began to fade subtly, replaced by tension and an undeniable edge of worry. Langston signaled calmly for the footage to stop. "Counselor, let's see the officer's written account again." Trina handed a printed copy of Hailey's report to the judge, who skimmed it slowly. He looked up directly toward Hailey, his voice firm and clear. "Officer Moore, your report states, and I quote, 'The suspect demonstrated sudden aggressive behavior, posing an immediate threat.' Does this video accurately represent your written statement?" Hailey opened her mouth impulsively. "Your Honor, I need to explain." Langston swiftly raised one hand, cutting her off sharply without raising his voice. "Officer Moore, in this courtroom, only I decide when someone speaks." Hailey immediately fell silent. Her cheeks flushed slightly. Her jaw tightened, eyes dropping momentarily to the table in front of her. Langston's tone remained controlled, measured, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. "You wrote specifically, 'Subject made sudden threatening movements.' Officer Moore, are you standing by that statement under oath?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Hailey hesitated visibly, eyes darting briefly toward the prosecutor beside her, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Hailey finally cleared her throat, voice softer, cautious. I may have overstated some details, Your Honor. I was trying to present what felt like the correct interpretation." Langston's gaze sharpened, interrupting firmly. "Officer Moore, let's be absolutely clear. Did you interpret, or did you knowingly misrepresent the events?" A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Trina watched closely, maintaining quiet composure. Elijah sat beside her, stiff but attentive, observing Hailey carefully. Hailey's voice wavered, barely audible. I wrote the report in a way I thought was standard practice." Langston leaned forward further, his voice cutting through the silence, deliberately emphasizing each word. "Did you think it was standard practice? Or did you clearly understand you were distorting the truth?" The question hung heavily. Hailey's hands clenched under the table, knuckles whitening. Finally, she spoke, her voice resigned. "I wrote statements that weren't accurate. I'm sorry, Your Honor." A brief murmur rippled through the gallery, immediately silenced by Langston's sharp glance around the courtroom. The judge's voice took on an authoritative finality. "Given Officer Moore's admission, this court orders an immediate review, not only of her arrest record, but of all procedures conducted by her former precinct, River Creek Police Department." He paused, gaze holding Hailey's firmly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "This investigation will examine all actions and practices within that department." The courtroom fell completely silent. Hailey sat motionless, suddenly understanding the gravity of her mistake. Unknowingly, she had just triggered something far bigger, an investigation that would extend well beyond herself. In Judge Langston's chambers, stacks of reports covered his desk. Daniel, his assistant, handed him another folder marked River Creek Police Department, Officer Training Records. Langston flipped open the folder, skimming the first few pages. He paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Lieutenant Russell again," he remarked quietly, shaking his head slightly. "I recognize this name." Daniel glanced up, sensing the judge's unease. "He was previously investigated, Your Honor. Accusations about falsified arrest reports. Nothing ever came of it officially." Langston's eyes remained focused on the paperwork, thoughtful. "Pull up all records linked to his training sessions. We need to see who else went through his program." Days later, an expanded inquiry into the River Creek Department uncovered disturbing patterns. Langston and several clerks gathered in a small conference room, surrounded by files, boxes of documents, and a large board mapping out connections. Multiple faces of arrested individuals, mostly Black or Latino, covered the board, linked to a growing number of questionable arrests. Langston listened carefully as Daniel briefed the room. It's not just Officer Moore. At least 20 officers were trained by Lieutenant Russell. Their reports frequently use the same phrases: immediate threat, aggressive suspect, even when video evidence contradicts those claims. Langston sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. This is not a series of isolated errors. This is systemic. Daniel nodded gravely. It gets worse, Your Honor. We've found something else. Langston raised an eyebrow. Go on. There's a software tool installed across multiple departments: River Creek, Richmond PD, and 2 others in neighboring states. It selectively erases bodycam footage when triggered. Someone high up authorized this. The room fell silent. Langston slowly rubbed his forehead, frustration evident, but controlled. You're certain about this? He asked firmly. Daniel handed him a printout. Confirmed by our technical team. Langston stood, studying the printout carefully, his voice tense. This isn't just poor judgment by individual officers. This is deliberate manipulation. Contact the FBI immediately. Request they open a full federal investigation. Tell them it's urgent. That afternoon, FBI agents arrived swiftly at the courthouse, taking statements and beginning a broader inquiry. The presence of federal agents drew immediate attention throughout the precincts. Inside River Creek Station, officers moved anxiously, whispering carefully among themselves. In a small interrogation room, 2 agents questioned Lieutenant Russell directly. The lieutenant sat rigidly upright, face carefully blank, providing clipped, carefully neutral answers. How do your trainees end up consistently filing misleading reports? One agent pressed calmly. Russell spoke evenly, eyes hard. They write exactly what they were trained to observe. Even when their observations don't match reality, the agent countered pointedly. Russell remained silent, eyes narrowing subtly, giving nothing away. Later, Hailey sat alone in the courthouse hallway, tense and withdrawn. Her posture stiffened further when Langston approached, standing calmly nearby, observing her quietly. Officer Moore, Langston spoke gently but firmly. You'll be called as a witness soon. You understand the importance of your testimony, correct? She didn't look up. Her eyes stayed fixed on the polished tile floor. She spoke quietly, almost inaudibly. I don't even know who to trust anymore. Langston kept his tone neutral. Trust the truth. It's the only thing that can help you now. She finally glanced upward, visibly uncertain. I did what they taught me. I followed orders. He studied her carefully, expression neutral but direct. You'll have a choice to make, Officer Moore. Think carefully. Langston stepped away without another word, leaving her sitting rigidly alone, conflicted and silent. Voices echoed from the courtroom as agents, attorneys, and officials filed inside, the magnitude of the investigation intensifying. Hailey could hear her name called clearly from the courtroom, pulling her abruptly back to reality. Officer Hailey Moore, please enter. She stood slowly, hesitating. Her gaze flickered toward the entrance, tension radiating through her as she took a deep breath, uncertain which side of this widening investigation she would finally choose. Hailey stood at the bathroom sink inside the courthouse, gripping the counter, eyes locked forward. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights filled the small, sterile space. She inhaled slowly, trying to steady her breathing. The bathroom door opened quietly behind her. In the mirror, she saw Nicole, Elijah's sister, stepping inside. Nicole hesitated briefly before moving calmly to the adjacent sink. Silence settled between them, tense but controlled. Nicole glanced at Hailey in the mirror, her face composed but tired. Hailey avoided eye contact, rinsing her hands mechanically. After a moment, Nicole spoke softly, her voice gentle but direct. Every Thursday, during my lunch break, I used to look out the window at the clinic and see Elijah waiting for me. Hailey froze, hands dripping above the sink. She didn't turn her head, eyes locked downward. Nicole continued quietly. No bitterness, just a heavy sadness. Now, every Thursday I still look out that same window, but Elijah isn't there anymore. Because of you. Hailey's eyes closed briefly, her posture stiffening further. Nicole didn't raise her voice or speak again. She just washed her hands carefully, drying them without another glance. Then, quietly, she left the room, leaving Hailey alone with the weight of her words. Hailey leaned against the sink, suddenly exhausted. The impact of Nicole's quiet statement affected her more deeply than any lawyer's arguments or judge's questions had. She looked into the mirror again, finally facing her own reflection directly. Her expression shifted subtly, no longer defiant, just tired and lost. Minutes later, Hailey entered the nearly empty courtroom again, steps slower, purposeful, yet uncertain. Judge Langston remained seated at the bench, glancing up carefully at her entrance. "Officer Moore," Langston acknowledged firmly, voice calm, expectant. "Have you made a decision?" She stepped forward, glancing at Langston directly, but briefly. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm ready to cooperate fully." Langston nodded once, encouraging her forward. Hailey took a position near the witness stand, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "I don't know where to start," she admitted quietly, voice wavering slightly. Langston observed carefully, neutral. "Start with the truth." She took a short breath, focusing carefully. "I was trained in River Creek by Lieutenant Russell. He taught us how to write arrest reports that would justify our actions, even if the facts didn't entirely support them." "Why?" Langston asked, gently but clearly. "Why teach officers to falsify reports?" Hailey hesitated, considering carefully. "To protect the department. To avoid lawsuits and scrutiny. We were told it was standard practice. Just how things worked." Langston leaned forward slightly, listening closely. "Did you believe that?" "At first, yes," she admitted. "But now, honestly, I don't even know what I was protecting anymore. I don't know who or what I served." Her voice grew steadier, clearer. "If speaking openly today can help fix this, if it can prevent what happened to Elijah from happening again, I'm ready to tell everything I know." Langston nodded once, understanding the weight of her decision. "Your testimony will make a difference. Are you prepared for that?" Hailey met his eyes directly for the first time, speaking firmly. "Yes, Your Honor. I am." Langston paused thoughtfully before turning to address the court clerk. "Contact the FBI and inform them Officer Moore is now fully cooperating as a witness." He glanced briefly, back at Hailey. "Thank you, officer." Hailey remained standing quietly at the witness stand, her gaze steady, resigned to the path she had chosen. She had crossed a point of no return, fully aware of the consequences. Outside, Nicole waited calmly in the hallway, glancing back toward the courtroom doors, hopeful but cautious. The full weight of what was about to happen, what was finally being revealed, now rested firmly on Hailey's shoulders. Judge Langston placed a thick folder carefully on the table in the meeting room, stepping back slightly as two FBI agents reached for it. They flipped silently through the pages, faces neutral but clearly focused. Langston watched closely, speaking firmly but quietly. "This goes far beyond one officer," the judge told them. "Officer Moore's testimony points to systematic corruption. The River Creek Department was training officers to falsify reports and conceal bodycam footage." One agent glanced up, nodding slightly. "We'll start with River Creek. But this might extend wider?" Langston's gaze didn't waver. "I believe so. Officer training records suggest similar practices in at least 3 other states. This was deliberate." The agents exchanged a quick glance, clearly understanding the implications. One stood up, adjusting his suit jacket briefly. "We'll begin immediately," he said, extending a hand to Langston. "Thanks, Judge." Langston nodded once, watching them leave before slowly sitting down, a deep sense of resolve clear on his face. Within days, FBI teams were deployed across multiple jurisdictions, quietly confiscating records and questioning officers. It soon became evident that dozens of police officers shared remarkably similar patterns in their arrest reports. Nearly all had gone through training sessions led by Lieutenant Russell, or instructors closely linked to him. At River Creek, the precinct buzzed with quiet anxiety as federal agents methodically collected computers, files, and personnel records. Lieutenant Russell himself was swiftly escorted from the building, tight-lipped, eyes avoiding contact with his former colleagues. In Richmond, the tension was palpable as Captain Drake, head of internal oversight, was approached by FBI agents, who calmly escorted him from his office. Officers watched silently as their supervisor left the building, understanding the gravity without words. Back in court, Hailey sat quietly, visibly unsettled by the swift pace of events. Langston observed her briefly, noting the careful way she avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Daniel approached quickly, leaning toward the judge's ear. "Your Honor, there's an issue," Daniel whispered urgently. "Officer Moore recently attempted to leak false information about your past. Media outlets have begun picking it up." Langston exhaled slowly, unfazed, addressing the open courtroom clearly and directly. "Before we continue, I need to clarify something for the record," Langston announced calmly. "Yes, years ago I was falsely imprisoned. I experienced firsthand the abuse of power. It is precisely that experience that makes me intolerant of injustice in this courtroom." A low, respectful silence settled throughout the room, punctuated only by reporters quietly scribbling notes. Hailey's face reddened deeply, gaze fixed downward, fully aware that her tactic had backfired dramatically. Days later, the federal court convened. Hailey, called as a witness, stepped hesitantly toward the witness stand. The gallery filled quickly with victims of past arrests, quietly seated together, watching her closely. Elijah and Nicole sat near the front, Nicole's eyes carefully neutral, Elijah's face tense but attentive. The prosecutor approached Hailey directly. "Officer Moore, can you describe clearly the training you received under Lieutenant Russell?" Hailey spoke carefully, voice quiet but clear. "We were taught specific ways to justify arrests, even if it meant adjusting details. We were encouraged to see certain individuals as threats, even when they weren't." The prosecutor continued calmly, direct and factual. "Did your department utilize software designed to erase selected body camera footage?" Hailey answered simply, her voice softening further. "Yes, the software was used regularly." Victims in the courtroom exchanged quiet, tense glances. Elijah's jaw tightened slightly, his posture rigid as he absorbed this confirmation. Hailey hesitated briefly, eyes briefly meeting Elijah's. Her expression shifted, quiet remorse evident in her posture and tone. "I need to apologize directly to those I wronged." The room stilled completely. "I believed I was protecting public safety," Hailey admitted quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "But I wasn't. I was protecting a system designed to abuse power and harm innocent people. People like Elijah Ward." She paused, breathing deeply. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." The silence that followed hung heavily in the courtroom. Victims looked cautiously toward one another, some faces softened by the acknowledgement. Others remained tense, unwilling or unable to forgive. At the bench, Langston listened closely, expression steady and calm. He slowly leaned forward, speaking firmly. "Officer Moore's testimony makes clear this corruption wasn't isolated. It was intentionally cultivated," Langston stated deliberately. "This court urges the full prosecution of all involved, from trainers to leadership." Hailey sat quietly again, shoulders sinking slightly. Her eyes met Nicole's briefly, silent acknowledgement passing between them. She had opened a door she could not close, fully aware this investigation would change everything. Judge Langston looked directly into the crowded courtroom, his voice firm and controlled. Today, we aren't simply addressing the misconduct of one officer. We're dismantling a flawed system at its roots. Hailey stood silently, visibly resigned, as Langston continued clearly. Officer Moore, you're sentenced to 5 years, 3 suspended, contingent on your ongoing cooperation with the federal investigation. You'll also participate in retraining programs dedicated to meaningful reform. Seated quietly nearby, Elijah and Michelle shared a subtle glance, relief evident but cautious. The newly appointed police chief stood and turned toward them, voice steady and respectful. To the victims affected, including Mr. Ward and his family, we extend a public and sincere apology. Full restitution will be provided to every individual harmed. Judge Langston's voice concluded firmly, resonating through the quiet courtroom. Power is not a weapon. It's a commitment to justice. Do you know someone innocent who's faced injustice? If this story resonated with you, please share it, because the truth gains strength when heard. And if you believe stories like these must continue to be told, subscribe to this channel. Justice can only speak clearly if there are people willing to listen.